Welcome to A Year of War and Peace. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. A Year of War and Peace is a daily, year-long, chapter-by-chapter reading of and meditation on Leo Tolstoy's epic novel, War and Peace. In these videos and podcasts, you'll be treated to a free reading of one chapter per day of the novel, plus a reflective essay I've written individually tailored to that day's chapter. These readings are offered for free, though if you'd like to support me, you can do so in one of three ways. First, you could purchase my ebook, A Year of War and Peace. It features the entire novel, plus all of my reflective essays, and it's only $2.99 on Amazon.com. You could also become a patron at patreon.com/Brian E. Denton. If you sign up there, you'll receive a sonnet once a month, plus a link to an ebook of my collected sonnets. Finally, if you like, you can make a one-time donation to my PayPal account. The email there is brianedenton@gmail.com. You can also use that email to contact me. I'd be happy to hear from you. Your support is greatly appreciated. Today's reading and reflection is on Chapter 173. Chapter 173. This letter had not yet been presented to the Emperor when Barclay, one day at dinner, informed Bolkonsky that the sovereign wished to see him personally, to question him about Turkey, and that Prince Andrew was to present himself at Benningsen's quarters at 6 that evening. News was received at the Emperor's quarters that very day of a fresh movement by Napoleon which might endanger the army, news subsequently found to be false. And that morning, Colonel Michaud had ridden round the Drissa fortifications with the Emperor and had pointed out to him that this fortified camp constructed by Fuel, until then considered a chef d'oeuvre of tactical science, which would ensure Napoleon's destruction, was an absurdity, threatening the destruction of the Russian army. Prince Andrew arrived at Benningsen's quarters, a country gentleman's house of moderate size, situated on the very banks of the river. Neither Benningsen nor the Emperor was there, but Chernyshev, the Emperor's aide-de-camp, received Bolkonsky and informed him that the Emperor, accompanied by General Benningsen and Marquis Paulucci, had gone a second time that day to inspect the fortifications of the Drissa camp, and of the suitability of which serious doubts were beginning to be felt. Chernyshev was sitting at a window in the first room with the French novel in his hand. This room had probably been a music room. There was still an organ in it on which some rugs were piled, and in one corner stood the folding bedstead of Benningsen's adjutant. This adjutant was also there and sat dozing on the rolled-up bedding, evidently exhausted by work or by feasting. Two doors led from the room, one straight on into what had been the drawing-room, and another on the right to the study. Through the first door came the sound of voices conversing in German and occasionally in French. In that drawing-room were gathered, by the Emperor's wish, not a military council, the Emperor preferred indefiniteness, but certain persons whose opinions he wished to know in view of the impending difficulties. It was not a council of war, but, as it were, a council to elucidate certain questions for the Emperor personally. To the semi-council had been invited the Swedish General Armfeldt, Adjutant General Woltzen, Wenskerode, whom Napoleon had referred to as a renegade French subject, Michaud, Toll, Count Stein, who was not a military man at all, and Fuel himself, who, as Prince Andrew had heard, was the mainspring of the whole affair. Prince Andrew had an opportunity of getting a good look at him, for Fuel arrived soon after himself, and in passing through the drawing-room, stopped a minute to speak to Chernyshev. At first sight, Fuel, in his ill-made uniform of a Russian general, which fitted him badly like a fancy costume, seemed familiar to Prince Andrew, though he saw him now for the first time. There was about him something of Weyrother, Mack, and Schmidt, and many other German theorist generals whom Prince Andrew had seen in 1805, but he was more typical than any of them. Prince Andrew had never yet seen a German theorist in whom all the characteristics of those were united to such an extent. Fuel was short and very thin, but broad-boned, of course, robustly built, broad in the hips, and with prominent shoulder blades. His face was much wrinkled, and his eyes deep-set. His hair had evidently been hastily brushed smooth in front of his temples, but struck up behind in quaint little tufts. He entered the room, looking restlessly and angrily around, as if afraid of everything in that large apartment. Awkwardly holding up his sword, he addressed Chernyshev, and asked in German where the Emperor was. One can see that he wished to pass through the rooms as quickly as possible, finish with the bows and greetings, and sit down to business in front of a map, where he would feel at home. He nodded hurriedly in reply to Chernyshev, and smiled ironically on hearing that the sovereign was inspecting the fortifications that he, Fuel, had planned in accordance with his theory. He muttered something to himself abruptly, and in a bass voice, as self-assured Germans do. It might have been a stupid fellow, or the whole affair will be ruined, or something absurd will come out of it. Prince Andrew did not catch what he said, and would have passed on, but Chernyshев introduced him to Fuel, remarking that Prince Andrew was just back from Turkey, where the war had terminated so fortunately. Fuel barely glanced, not so much at Prince Andrew as past him, and said with a laugh, "That must have been a fine tactical war," and laughing contemptuously, went on into the room from which the sound of voices was heard. Fuel, always inclined to be irritably sarcastic, was particularly disturbed that day, evidently by the fact that they had dared to inspect and criticize his camp in his absence. From this short interview with Fuel, Prince Andrew, thanks to his Austerlitz experience, was able to form a clear conception of the man. Fuel was one of those hopelessly and immutably self-confident men, self-confident to the point of martyrdom, as only Germans are, because only Germans are self-confident on the basis of an abstract notion, science, that is, the supposed knowledge of absolute truth. A Frenchman is self-assured because he regards himself personally, both in mind and body, as irresistibly attractive to men and women. An Englishman is self-assured as being a citizen of the best organized state in the world, and therefore as an Englishman always knows what he should do, and knows that all he does as an Englishman is undoubtedly correct. An Italian is self-assured because he is excitable and easily forgets himself and other people. A Russian is self-assured just because he knows nothing and does not want to know anything, since he does not believe that anything can be known. Smart. The German's self-assurance is worst of all, stronger and more repulsive than any other, because he imagines that he knows the truth, science, which he himself has invented, but which is for him the absolute truth. Fuel was evidently of that sort. He had a science, the theory of oblique movements deduced him from the history of Frederick the Great wars, and all he came across in the history of more recent warfare seemed to him absurd and barbarous, monstrous collisions in which so many blunders were committed by both sides, that these wars could not be called wars, that they did not accord with a theory, and therefore could not serve as material for science. In 1806, Fuel had been one of those responsible for the plan and campaign that ended in Jena and Auerstadt, and he did not see the least proof of the fallibility of this theory in the disasters of that war. On the contrary, the deviations made from his theory were, in his opinion, the sole cause of the whole disaster, and with characteristically gleeful sarcasm, he would remark, "There, I said the whole affair would go to the devil." Fuel was one of those theoreticians who so love their theory that they lose sight of the theory's object, its practical application. His love of theory made him hate everything practical, and he would not listen to it. He was even pleased by failures, for failures resulting from deviations in practice from the theory only proved to him the accuracy of his theory. He said a few words to Prince Andrew and Chernyshев about the present war, with the air of a man who knows beforehand all that will go wrong, and who is not displeased that it should be so. The unbrushed tufts of hair sticking up behind, and the hastily brushed hair of its temples, expressed this most eloquently. He passed into the next room, and the deep querulous sounds of his voice were at once heard from there. All right, that concludes my reading of chapter 173. I hope you enjoyed it. I will now proceed to my reflection on the same. A Year of War and Peace, Day 173. Critical of Theory. Alexander Fleming did not start with a theory of penicillin and then work his way towards developing the medicine. He discovered penicillin by means of exploration, experience, and tinkering. Fleming was a professor of bacteriology at St. Mary's Hospital in London. One day, having returned from holiday, he just happened to be sorting through some petri dishes containing bacteria when he noticed something unusual. The petri dish was littered with colonies of bacteria, save for a zone immediately surrounding the space where an odd mold grew. That odd mold, it turns out, was Penicillium notatum. Dr. Fleming published his findings, and then other researchers, mostly also at Oxford University, further developed penicillin. They did so not means by theory, but rather by means of practice and experimentation. These great practitioners stand in contrast to Fuel, a German general who Prince Andrew meets in today's chapter. Fuel, you see, has a theory of war. His is a top-down science of war, developed from years of studying the writings of Frederick the Great. But war, as Tolstoy writes and Prince Andrew has discovered through experience, is probably more of a bottom-up emergent property, So unless battle is waged merely by fingering pages of Prussian letters, it can be assumed that Fuel's theory will be seriously compromised by war in practice, which is exactly what happens. Fuel is one of those generals responsible for planning the disastrous campaigns at Jena and Otterstadt. Both of those battles in practice proved his theory to be wanting. In his mind, however, they merely proved the failure of the exact implementation of his theory. Fuel, like Prince Andrew, has been summoned to offer advice to Tsar Alexander. Alexander should beware of smart Germans bearing theories. Daily meditation. In theory, there is no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is. Yogi Berra. All right, that concludes my reading of and reflection on chapter 173 of War and Peace. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks so much for joining me today. Remember that if you'd like to support me, you can do so either by purchasing the ebook A Year of War and Peace, becoming a patron at patreon.com, or making a one-time donation to PayPal. The links to all that are down below in the show notes. Tomorrow, we are going to be reading and reflecting on chapter 174 of War and Peace. I hope you'll join me. Until then, take care of yourselves and others.